Good morning, Bill. For those who are viewing this video, I'm Robert Simon, and I am interviewing Bill Keleher, who is one of the preeminent lawyers in Albuquerque and New Mexico, and whose family has been associated with the legal profession for many years. And we're going to discuss some of that history here today. Bill, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you.
If I may, could we start with a little bit of your history and how you got into the legal profession?
Well, I always knew I wanted to be a lawyer. My father was a lawyer. I knew he practiced law. I was intrigued by it. Dad, of course, had the attorney-client privilege, so he didn't talk specifics, but it was something that always interested me. I know that in the 8th grade, we had an assignment, what we were going to do, and I knew then that I wanted to be a lawyer. Always knew it. I was in a courthouse. I think the first time I was in a courthouse with Dad was when I was 5 years old. He took me up to Taos, New Mexico, spent the night up there, and the next morning I had no idea what the case was about. I just remember sitting in the courtroom, and I was probably reading a book on the bench.
I see. Can you tell me a little bit, perhaps, about the firm you're with, the Keleher firm, which is one of the older firms in New Mexico?
Well, of course, Dad started practicing law in 1915. He graduated from Washington and Lee University. After the 2-year course at Washington and Lee, he had been admitted as a special student to Washington and Lee. Special student because he had no college education, he had no high school education. He dropped out of St. Mary's grade school when he was in the 8th grade. His father was sick and he needed to help financially support the family. He became a lawyer in 1915. He practiced law. He had a half of an office in what was called the Cromwell Building. That's second in gold. Cromwell Building, the bottom floor was occupied by P.F. McKenna, one of the oldest real estate insurance businesses in the state. P.F. McKenna was a good friend of his. P.F. McKenna had lent him money to go to law school. Dad kept every note that he signed, and I think the total of those notes, which were found after my mother's death in Dad's papers, which I never looked at after Dad had died, but after Mother died I did. I think there were $650. That was what essentially financed the legal education.
And then did your father form that Keleher firm?
Well, he practiced independently. He at one time was a partner with a fellow by the name of Downer and Keleher. That separated. In 1929, he hired A.H. McLeod. There was a lawyer by the name of Ted Jones with them. There were some other lawyers. Bob Nordhaus worked in 1935 after graduating from Yale University Law School. Bob was just with Dad for a year. Later, Joe Ryan, who graduated from the University of Southern California in 1949, and Tim Keleher joined Dad. McLeod practiced in the First National Bank building. Well, Dad moved into the First National Bank building from the Cromwell building when the First National Bank building, the 3rd and Central, was built. He said he got a telephone call one day and the bank was going to build a building, 5-story building, and would he be interested in an office? He said definitely, and he thought the building would be too small at 5 stories. They ought to build a bigger one, and eventually it was 8 stories. That building was completed in 1922. As an office building, as a prominent office building for the First National Bank of Albuquerque.
And that building still stands?
That building still stands. The First National Bank of Albuquerque went into receivership in 1933. It couldn't open after Roosevelt had the bank holiday. Then it opened for a while, but it eventually failed. It was the largest bank in Albuquerque at that time. I can get back to the bank later because that's an
Sure.
important part of it. And then
Let's try to carry through with the firm growth.
The firm. 1968, we moved to the Public Service Company in the Mexico building. We took about 60% of one floor, the 9th floor. I think there were 8 lawyers at that time. Rand Miller had come. Pat Hurley joined us shortly thereafter. But it was, the firm consisted of my dad, McLeod, John Tippman, Tim Keleher, Russell Moore, my brother Mike, and myself as partners, and Rand Miller, Bill Stratford, and Pat Hurley came along. We began to expand. Public Service Company began to grow. Eventually, we had most of 3 floors in the Public Service building. We opened an office at the Louisiana Indian School Road, a branch office, and gave up part of the space at the Public Service building. Public Service was growing, and so they, even though you had a lease, if you wanted out, they could always use the space, and we're glad to. They were very, very good to us.
If you will, please, I know that I don't know all of the major clients, but you've indicated that Public Service was one of the major clients. Can you give us a little bit of the history of the firm association with Public Service Company and its growth, and which I am going to guess parallels the growth of your firm to some extent?
It certainly did. Public Service Company was a subsidiary. Was actually Albuquerque Gas and Electric. Albuquerque Gas and Electric was organized in 1917 as a corporation. It was a successor to Electric Utility. It had the electric and gas. In 1935, when my father began to do work for Public Service Company in Mexico, it was owned by a company called Federal Light and Traction, which is a subsidiary of City Service. The federal law, the Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935, resulted in holding companies effectively being outlawed, and Public Service Company was formed by merging the Santa Fe, Las Vegas, and Deming companies into Albuquerque Gas and Electric, and the name was changed in 1947, and the stock was sold to the public. Shortly thereafter, the gas company was sold to Southern Union Gas, and it was just an electric company in the cities that it served, as well as water in Santa Fe and Las Vegas. The first work that I really began to do with Public Service, it was not a big client. Well, it was a big client, but it wasn't the dominant client. Our dominant business was USF&G, St. Paul, and other insurance companies. We were primarily an insurance defense firm. In the early 1960s, the legislature brought the REAs under the jurisdiction of the Public Service Commission, and that's when I began to get heavily involved in Public Service Company work. I became more and more involved. My father had been general counsel, and in 1969 I was appointed general counsel, although that was on the basis that I wasn't an employee of Public Service Company. They used lawyers that were not employees.
You were outside counsel?
I was outside counsel. But I went to all of the Public Service Board meetings. The revenues were about $35 million a year, and by 1990 they were in the neighborhood of $750 million a year, and Public Service Company at that time decided to go in-house. And Pat Ortiz was appointed general counsel and vice president general counsel, and they built their own in-house legal department from that point on. Although we continued to do work, and they're still doing work for Public Service Company in Mexico. But we've had many other clients. We've retained a number of insurance companies over the years. We do work for families. I'm currently probating the estate of gentleman who died in 2005. We have files as well as I'm doing work for his cousin. We've done work for the earliest file that we have in the office was for their grandfather that we did work in. Dad did work in 1917. along with George Downer. So now the family hasn't always used this, as generations change and business changes, but we do have some old relationships that go very far back.
Why don't you give us a little bit of your history about where you went to school and how you got into practice, and then some of your clients that, besides like this probate matter.
Well, I went to Monsanto for kindergarten. The first year it opened, it was in 1938.
And you were born and grew up in Albuquerque, right?
I wasn't born here, but I did grow up here. And in 1938, I was in the first year that Monsanto was a school, founded by Ruth Hannah McCormick Sims. It's still in business today. Sims family has been very good to the education of students in Albuquerque. Mrs. Sims not only founded Monsanto, she founded the Sandia Girls School, and later her husband, after she was dead, Albert Sims, was instrumental in funding, but was not the founder of Albuquerque Academy. I went to St. Mary's Grade School in the first grade, Lou Wallace in the second and third grade. Returned to St. Mary's in 10th grade. I went to New Mexico Military Institute. I came back to Albuquerque after high school, went to the University of New Mexico. 1955, June 1955, I graduated from UNM. Was commissioned as an Air Force officer in the ROTC program. Went to Stanford Law School. The Air Force said I should try to go to summer school if I possibly could, which was possible. Stanford had a summer program. So I graduated, rather than graduating in June of 1958, I graduated in January of 1958, took the February 58 bar, passed it, went in the Air Force. I was assistant staff judge advocate at Stewart Air Force Base in Newburgh, New York, Air Defense Command Base. 2 years in the service. Actually, between the time I was admitted to the bar and went in the Air Force, I worked in the office for about 6 weeks, but obviously couldn't give you a whole lot to do because you were leaving. But I was there. I had worked in the office as a courier. I think it was in 1952. I would run errands, serve subpoenas, went to depositions, went to trials. Actually, when I was in college, Dad had a childhood friend that had a brush with the Albuquerque City Police and wanted a lawyer, and Dad called me and told me, go and defend this guy, and I went in and tried him in the Albuquerque Municipal Court. You didn't have to be a lawyer. I wasn't a lawyer, but I defended him, and Judge Brown convicted him. I later talked to Brown after I was a lawyer and explained the case again, and Brown said, well, I think I should have acquitted him. Based on that ex parte communication. At that time, of course, the case was long gone, and I don't know that it was ex parte, but that was the first lawsuit I really tried when I was about a junior in college. And perfectly legal. The Air Force legal business wasn't too heavy. I was claims officer, as well as being assistant staff judge advocate, which meant that I investigated aircraft accidents, automobile accidents. Absolutely no training. Just I had the orders, and I did that. We had crashes. We had a mid-air collision. Did what I was supposed to do. Came back in 1960. My dad was 74 years old at that time, and I was able to. They gave me I had to practice. My desk was full. Well, again, with respect to Dad's practice of law from 1915 to, he really practiced until he was about 82. He was still seeing people. But Dad had a difficult job, life financially. His father got sick, died when he was young. He and his, they survived. He was a newspaper reporter, city editor of the Journal, and he could write. And that, I think, is how he got into law school. Before he was a newspaper reporter, he'd been, his first real job was as a telegraph boy. Then he was telegraph operator. The telegraph, Western Union used what they call the Phillips Code. Dad said that when things got dull as a newspaper reporter, he would go down to the telegraph office and just listen to what was coming in. Sometimes you'd hear that such a prominent person was coming through on the train, and they would deliver the train. He could just transcribe the dot dashes mentally. He'd go down to the train, he'd interview them, publish it in the newspaper. He also noticed that guys were beginning to die off, so he began to keep newspaper clippings, write them letters, etc. He had these files, and that's what led him into writing history. I really, as a child, never knew that he was writing history so much. He published his first book in '52. He published Violence in Lincoln County. I think it came out in '57, and then later his memoirs. His memoirs end with 1969. I said, "Dad, why 60? I get no. The reverse is true as to what date it started." Well, you were born in 1886. He said, "Well, I can't remember anything in 1886." So he used the dates that he could remember. But Dad would go down apparently to an office that he would find in downtown Albuquerque and write there. During World War II, he had a key to the U.S. courthouse at 5th and Gold. He was using Judge Colin Neblet's chambers to write. Neblet was the federal court judge in Santa Fe. That's where he officed, but this was a spare office. And the General Services Administration, GAO or whatever it was, I guess GSA, told Neblet they needed the office space during the war. And Neblet said he needed it. This is what Dad told me, that the federal government said, "Well, the only one that's used in your office is that lawyer. We know you gave him a key to the courthouse, and he goes down there early in the morning and he works until about breakfast time, and then he leaves. It's not being used during the day." Well, Neblet said, "I need the office," is what I said. And of course, you can't fight a federal judge. He kept the office. Dad, today, with the security of the federal courthouses, no lawyer could have a key to the courthouse. But he would write these books. He said he never would write in the office. He did have his secretary send letters out, but he didn't, his inquiry letters. And he kept these files. And so when he had these files, and the Journal or the Tribune of newspapers would call him for comment for accuracy. When the Masonic Lodge caught fire one night and was burning in the evening, the Journal called him and said, "When was the Masonic Lodge building built? Who built it?" and that sort of thing. We've talked to the Masonic people that we can get in contact with, and of course Dad, Roman Catholic, had nothing to do with the Masonic Lodge. He said, "I'll have to check that, I'll call you back." So he went to his files to call back. But he would have these files. And all of these files we gave after Mom died. Mom died in 2000. She was almost 103 years old. At that time, I went over all of the files to purge them of attorney-client privileges. The rest of them were given to the University of New Mexico for the Southwest Collection, along with Dad's library. Dad wanted kept together.
That's where you got your rich appreciation for history, and
Well,
especially
a lot of it
Albuquerque history.
A lot of it came from because Dad was older, as I said, when his friends, his contemporaries, an older set. My mother, although she was 10, 11 years younger than Dad, she was still, so they could have been my grandparents. Mother came to the University of New Mexico to teach women's physical education. She taught one summer, the summer of 25, and then she came back in the fall of 27 after being offered a permanent position. Saw in the Mirage magazine the other day that she was the coach of the University of New Mexico women's basketball team. I never knew that, but they had a picture in the magazine, the alumni magazine, of the girls basketball team and their coach. They didn't have any names, and that's Mother. So I'd hear these stories, and a lot of it just came. Anyway, Dad wrote his history and didn't allow it to interfere with the practice of law.
And would you give us the name of his history that he wrote?
Well, there are 3 books. There's the 5 books. There's the Maxwell Land Grant, definitive work on the history of the Maxwell Land Grant. It was written, he said, as an exercise to demonstrate the problems of the land grant, the procedures, and that sort of thing. The second one was The Fabulous Frontier, which is really a series of 12 separate items. History of Oliver Lee. That's what I call an authorized biography, because according to the story that Dad told me, Oliver Lee's, he was tried for the murder of A.J. Fountain and his son. He was acquitted. They were tried in Hillsborough, New Mexico. There were cowboys stationed in the front row of the courthouse every day with a horse outside the courthouse, and they had a horse staked out at intervals all the way to Mexico in case he was acquitted. He wasn't going to jail. But the son said they would kill anybody that ever wrote the history of their father. And later, one of the boys told Dad, he said, we know you'll be fair. We're getting old. There's a rumor around, but we want you to know that rumor is not true. You would not be killed if you wrote the history of our father. So Dad wrote Oliver Lee, and one of the funny things about that, one of the good friends of Dad was Ernest Blumenschein. Ernest Blumenschein, famous artist that's got now a work of down in the...
One of the founders of the Taos Artist Society.
Yeah, one of the two, and he, big exhibit at the Albuquerque Museum, but...
Beautiful exhibit.
The only photograph they could have of Oliver, that they could get of Oliver Lee was with a Model A in the background. And Dad didn't like that. And Blumenschein had been an illustrator in his years for magazines. So Dad had him paint a gun and paint out the Model A, paint boots on. If you look at the photograph carefully in the book, you can see it's been touched up. The next book was Turmoil in New Mexico, which is really should have been 4 books, in my opinion, because it's got the Confederates coming to New Mexico. It's got the Long Walk. The fourth is Violence in Lincoln County, which is really the first definitive work on the Lincoln County War. And then the 5th book was his memoirs, which when the University of New Mexico republished the books, they didn't like the title, and so it was brought out as New Mexicans I Have Known. And all of those books were recently brought out by Sunstone Press again, so they're once again available.
Wonderful.
Let me see, it's off the record a minute.
Yes.
When you said, is there anything else, I thought of the... Well, you asked about my activities as a lawyer. I have not been, never run for political office, and I've never really been active in the Republican Party, the Democratic Party. My father was Democratic State Chairman in the 30s, early 30s, for a short time, but he was always behind the scenes. I'm quite confident he would be he had connections, I'll say. He'd been on the State Board of Finance for many years. I know at one time there was a dispute between a certain newspaper reporter and the governor, and at that time, and so Dad had a meeting one night after dinner, and the governor came to our house, and the newspaper reporter came to our house, and I thought I would be able to listen in. Unfortunately, they went into a secluded area of the house, and I didn't hear how that went down. But my first real involvement with politics was when Pete Domenici ran for mayor. He ran for city commission in 1966. I was attending a city commission meeting. I'd known Pete for a long time, but primarily as young lawyers practicing law. He asked me into his office after the commission meeting, wanted to see me, and he said he was going to run for governor, and I said, "What party are you?" He said, "He's a Republican." I said, "I'm a Democrat, but I'll switch." I had helped him a little bit in the commission when he ran for a city commission, but then he was elected, very little involvement. Switched to the Republican Party when he ran for governor, and then when in the Senate races, of course, he was elected November 7, 1972, to the United States Senate. I later helped in subsequent elections. In 1984, I guess I was co-chair of his finance committee, and in 1996, I was chair of his committee to re-elect him, and in 2002, chair to re-elect him. And he'd asked me to be chair again for the 2008 campaign, but of course I'd accepted, but he withdrew. Of course, being chair is a pretty easy job when you have such a person as Pete Domenici. People return your calls, and we have a paid campaign manager. They did a great job, and they're full-time staff, and you have some paid staff, and but I did do those, and that's been my principal connection with politics.
Interesting. And we're sitting across the street from his father's house, or his family's house.
Yeah, they bought that about 1944.
Did they?
43. They lived over near St. Mary's Grade School on 7th Street or something. I don't know where they lived. And even though I lived only 2 blocks down here, he never buddied around with this neighborhood group.
I see.
Okay?
Thank you so much, Bill.
You betcha.